Hello, welcome, Hag Sameach, everybody. Passover coming in tonight. Couldn't come at a better time. The holiday, the freedom, the festival of our joy, of miracles, of freedom. Remembering our enslavement and how God pulled us out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Hag Sameach, and we say Hag Kasher v'Sameach. I heard a beautiful teaching a few years ago from Mark Mandelbaum about that. Why do we say Hag Kasher v'Sameach? So kasher, right, that you didn't encounter any chametz. There was nothing in your house that shouldn't have been there. You were able to keep Passover with all its details, and sameach with joy, of course. But we say kasher first. You would think maybe sameach first and then the details of the laws. But we say kasher first. And simple teaching on that is we override, right? We override all halachas to save a life. So if a person was very ill and he needed to eat chametz, he needed to eat bread during Passover in order to survive his illness, of course we would give him the bread. And so when we say Hag Kasher v'Sameach, we say you should be healthy and well and not need anything that's not kosher during Pesach. So Hag Kasher v'Sameach. Let's light up the darkness. I can actually smell on my shirt. I was at the beer chametz biur, right? The burning, the destruction of the chametz. We had one of those old-fashioned, tin wash tubs, and we put in the branches of the lulav from Sukkot that we save until this time. It becomes the fuel to burn the chametz. Had a nice little bonfire and then made the declaration, any chametz that I might not have observed or I observed but I didn't see it, anything that might be in my possession, anything that I somehow missed, it should be nullified like what I just burnt. And now we're heading, God willing, with a clear conscience, a clear soul, a clear readiness, right? This is that day in the calendar tonight, right? That was the plague of the firstborn in Egypt, right? So all the Egyptian firstborn. And the Jews were instructed, right, to slaughter what was the god of the Egyptians, right? These young lambs is something that the Egyptians in their paganism were worshiping. And it took a certain degree of faith and guts, right, to set aside a lamb to slaughter it within Egypt. And then we put some of that blood on the doorposts and the lintel of our homes in Egypt. And then the angel of death, right, passed by the Jewish homes and inflicted the final plague, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, which resulted in the Egyptians saying, enough, we don't need you as slaves anymore. Get out, go. And take payment for all the work that you've done as slaves for these hundreds of years. But it was that night of waiting, and then the next day, out we go with that bread of affliction, that bread that is made hurriedly, the unleavened bread that we'll eat tonight, the matzah at our Seder. So very, very special day in our calendars. And when you think about that, in the daily prayers, we repeat over and over and over again, I am the God who redeemed you from Egypt, a remembrance of our enslavement in Egypt, a remembrance of coming out of that narrow place of constriction. This is when the Jews became the Jewish nation. This is when we were molded together as a people as well as a family. Okay. Our daf today is page 72 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. We're picking this up right at the top of page 72a and continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 9. Let me just welcome everybody. Yehudit in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Gordo in Scotland, Shandora in the Bronx, Chaim in Florida, and Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so Mishnah number 9, and with this, we're going to finish, with God's help, chapter 6 here in Menachos. So the Mishnah taught, and one may reap crops prior to the omer, due to potential damage to saplings growing alongside the crops, and due to the place of mourning, to create room for those consoling the mourners who would bless them upon their return from the cemetery. And, right, see, these are reasons why you can reap, where you're not reaping just because you want to eat the barley, but because there's some other reason why you need to cut down the barley, and that you can do before the omer sacrifice was brought on the second day of Passover. Right, incredible synchronicity this year that we have. But for these consumption reasons, not for the reasons of eating the barley, but for these other kinds of reasons, okay, you could reap it before the omer offering was brought. Otherwise, you have to wait until after. But it's going to be done in a non-standard special manner where we're cognizant that we're reaping before the omer, but we're not going to reap in the normal way, as we shall see. And you can also reap due to the need to create room for students to study, if failure to do so would lead to dereliction of Torah study in the study hall. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that one is permitted to reap prior to the omer offering in these instances? And the Gemara answers that the merciful one states, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, in Leviticus 23:10. And the use of the term your harvest indicates that the omer offering's reaping must precede any personal harvest, right, for you to eat or profit from it, but it does not need to precede reaping for the purpose of a mitzvah, right, making way for people consoling mourners, making way for Torah study, making way for other kinds of growth. The Mishnah teaches after reaping the crops for any of these reasons, one may not fashion them into sheaves. This is what I mean by non-standard harvest. But rather, he leaves them unbound. Okay, you can cut it down to stop the growth in the field, but you don't gather them into sheaves the way you normally would. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason? Gemara answers, although reaping is technically permitted, one should limit his involvement with the new grain. Therefore, as much as possible, to avoid exerting effort in involvement with the grain, we do not exert effort. And as we're going to see some other examples over the course of today's daf, okay, there are times when you override a prohibition, like a Shabbos prohibition or harvest early before the omer. But when you need to do that, you minimize the degree to which you're overriding the prohibition. Now, the Mishna teaches that the mitzvah of the omer is to bring the barley from the standing grain. Now, when they're using the word mitzvah here, right? Mitzvah means commandment. Everything that we're talking about is commandments. But when the Gemara just doesn't say this is what you must do, but actually brings in the word mitzvah, so what they're saying is this is the correct procedure for following the commandment that we're talking about. Right? So the mitzvah of the omer is to bring the barley from the standing grain. Ideally, you're going to find barley growing in a field. You're going to reap that on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover, during the night. And in the morning, you're going to bring it to the temple. And they're going to do the procedure of winnowing, sifting, grinding, turning it into dough, and bringing the meal offering of the omer. That's the correct, ideal way to do it. Sometimes you can't do it the ideal way. So the mitzvah of the omer is to bring the barley from the standing grain. And the sages taught in the Baraisa, what is the meaning when the verse states, and if you bring a meal offering of first fruits to the Lord, you shall bring for the meal offering of your first fruits grain in the ear, parched with fire, even groats of the fresh ear. Leviticus 2:14. We've been reading that verse a lot in the last week. So that's the verse for the omer offering. So the Bryce explains, since the mitzvah of the omer is to bring the barley from the standing grain, from where is it derived that if one does not find barley from the standing grain, he should bring it from the harvested and gathered sheaves? And the verse states, you shall bring, to include this scenario. If that's the only barley we got, we'd rather bring it from a harvested sheaf. Alternatively, the Baraisa suggests another reason why, and where do we already harvest? Right, we could harvest in barley that grows in irrigated fields and valleys, where it needed to be harvested earlier or would have rotted in the field. So ideally, we're bringing it from barley that is ready to be reaped at the time of the omer offering. If that's not available, we might go to that early harvest. Now, alternatively, the Baraisa suggests another reason why the verse states, you shall bring. Since it is a mitzvah to bring the omer from the moist grain, one can ask, from where is it derived that if one does not find barley from the moist grain, he should bring it from the dry grain? So the verse states, you shall bring, to include this case. Alternatively, the term you shall bring teaches the following. Since the mitzvah of the omer is for it to be reaped at night, from where is it derived that if it was reaped during the daytime, it is fit? The verse states, you shall bring. Now the Baraisa adds more laws that are derived from this same verse. From where is it derived that the omer offering overrides Shabbos? Now normally we don't reap, right? We don't go into a field and harvest on a holiday, right? Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, a Hag, a Yom Tov, and also Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, of course, we don't harvest, right? But obviously, on the second day of Passover, we're going to reap in order to bring the omer, as we've learned over and over. Now, what if the second day of Pesach is Shabbos? Now, there's an additional and even stronger reason where there's a prohibition on reaping. Are we going to override Shabbos to reap and bring the omer on the second day of Pesach? Right? From where is it derived that the omer offering does override Shabbos? The verse states, you shall bring. Also, this term, you shall bring, teaches that the omer is brought in any manner that it is found, even from gathered sheaves, right? So you're getting a lot of this you shall bring is doing a lot of work. right? It's telling you, you shall bring it on that day. You shall bring it even if you don't have moist barley standing on the ear in the field. You shall bring it even if it means harvesting it on Shabbos. Furthermore, the term you shall bring teaches that the omer crop may be brought from anywhere in the land of Israel if none is found near Jerusalem. So, right, three things that we're seeing here: the ideal way, and if you can't do it the ideal way, you do it anyway. And generally speaking, with mitzvahs, right, there's this idea of hadar mitzvah, beautifying the mitzvah, right? There are ideal ways to do the mitzvahs. And so we should be thinking just in the same way that a craftsman or an artist, and an artist could include a martial artist, right? Or a golfer, or, somebody who's a gardener, right? Anybody, any avocation that you have, any skill that you are developing, a passion of yours, a hobby, right? You get better and better at it. You don't just find some way that manages to get the job done that when you were a beginner and just keep doing it the same way over and over again. Ideally, you should get better at the things that you do. You should get better at praying. You should get better at cooking. You should get better at bringing the omer, right? And as we come to understand it better, then we see that built in, there are ideal ways to do it, right? Harvest it when it's on the stalk, in the field, near Jerusalem, so that it's moist. But if we can't do the ideal way, and life so often throws us a curveball, I'm a golfer, and one of the wonderful lessons of golf is that you almost never, ever play a hole the way you ideally wanted to play it. You find yourselves in the situations that you got yourself into, bad lie, in the woods, behind a rock, and then you get on with it and manage to extricate yourself doing the best that you can and move on, right? And it's the same idea, right? So, okay, there wasn't barley on the stalk this year. It wasn't near Jerusalem. Okay, well, let's get it as close to Jerusalem as we can. Let's get it as fresh as we can, right? And that's what we do, and then we're happy for that opportunity. Anywhere in Israel, it has to be from Israel, the omer, but it doesn't have to be near Jerusalem, but ideally it is near Jerusalem. Additionally, you shall bring teaches that it may be brought even on Shabbos. And lastly, you shall bring teaches that it may be brought even in a state of tumah, right? Priests cannot be tamei when they're bringing offerings. That which they bring cannot be tamei when it's being brought. But if the option is either you're not going to bring the omer or it's going to be tamei and the priest who brings it is going to be tamei, we prefer it not be that way, but if that's the only way, we do it. The Mishna teaches if it was reaped during the day, it is fit. This is as opposed to the ideal way, right? Remember, every day in the Jewish calendar begins the night before, right? So this would be tonight, right, is the first night of Passover. Tomorrow is the first day of Passover. Tomorrow night, this year, Thursday night, that's the beginning of the 16th of Nisan. And it's during that night that they would send people out to reap the barley in the field so that they had it first thing in the morning to prepare it into a meal offering. But if for some reason you couldn't find it during the night and you found it during the day, then you reap it during the day. Right? The Mishnah teaches if it was reaped during the day, it is fit. The Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in a Mishnah, Tractate Megillah, page 20b, all mitzvahs that must be performed at night may be performed any time during that night. Therefore, the entire night is valid for reaping the omer on the night following the first day of Passover, for burning the fats of offerings that had been brought during the preceding day, and for burning the limbs of burnt offerings. That's all done on that night. This is the principle, a matter that it is a mitzvah to perform during the entire day is valid, performed any time during the entire day, and likewise a matter that it is a mitzvah to perform at night is valid if performed any time during the entire night. So what are they telling us? Well, that sounds like what if it's the mitzvah to reap the barley during the night of the 16th of Nisan, right, when we're celebrating the second Seder outside of Israel. The night, right? The night. The mitzvah's at night. You could do it any time during the night, but therefore it should not be valid if you can't get it done until the next daylight. So the Gemara analyzes the Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches the principle of mitzvahs performed at night as being similar to the principle of those performed during the day. Well, from this one can infer that just as in the case of a mitzvah whose prescribed time is by day, that if it is performed at night, it is not valid. If it is performed by day, and therefore a mitzvah whose time is prescribed to happen during the night, should not be valid if it's performed during the day. So Rabbah said, it is not difficult. La kasha. This Mishnah, which teaches that the omer reaped during the day is valid, this is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbi. And that Mishnah in Megillah, which seems to indicate that which is done during the night can be done anytime during the night, but once it's done during the day is not valid. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, which would seem to indicate that Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, would say that if the barley is harvested for the omer after daylight on the 16th of Nisan, it would not be fit. Seems to be saying that. Let's keep reading. As it is taught in the Baraisa, in a case where a priest was standing and sacrificing the omer meal offering, and it became tamei in his hand, if there is another measure of barley grain that is ready to be reaped, then one says to the priest, reap the barley and bring another meal offering in its stead. Okay, well, that would seem to indicate that you can reap during the day, but only if that which you had reaped during the night became tamei, and now we have an alternative to bringing a tamei offering, which is to reap during the day, to have a new measure of barley for the replacement offering. And if there is no alternative meal offering available, one says to him, be shrewd and keep silent. Be shrewd and keep silent. I.e., do not tell anyone that it is impure. This is the statement of Rebbi. Right? So Rebbi is like, okay, pick it during the day if you need to, but if you can't pick it during the day, then okay, it's going to have to be brought tamei. We don't have a choice, but be shrewd and keep silent. And Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, says, in either case, one says to him, be shrewd and keep silent. Why? As any omer offering that is harvested not in accordance with the procedure dictated by its mitzvah is unfit. They're saying if it became tamei, then even if there is barley available to be reaped during the day, better you should bring the tamei offering that was reaped during the night, right? That's a bigger disqualification than tuma. It would be unfit if it was reaped during the day because it would be outside of its mitzvah. Becoming tamei is something that we need to do when there's no alternative. And according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, it's not an alternative to harvest during the day, even if it's available, because that's just totally unfit. Better it should be tamei. Now, with regard to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, that barley for the omer offering is reaped, that barley for the omer offering which is reaped by day is unfit. About this, Rabbi Bar Chana says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, said his statement in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the teacher of his father. As we learned in a Mishnah, tractate Shabbos 130a, Rabbi Akiva stated a principle: any prohibited labor that can be performed on Erev Shabbos, i.e. before Shabbos begins, does not override Shabbos, right? So the classic example of this is a bris, right? A circumcision. So if the 8th day of a Jewish baby boy's life is on Shabbos, do we perform the circumcision? Now, normally performing a circumcision or any procedure that draws blood is prohibited on Shabbos. course, you would do it to save a life if somebody needed an operation. But a circumcision is not a life-saving operation. So does a bris override Shabbos? Yes, in its time, right? Because you have to do it on the 8th day. You shall do it on the 8th day. That's another example where, because it says you shall do this on the 8th day, it overrides Shabbos. But what do you need in order to do a circumcision? Very sharp knife. Does that, let's say you don't have a knife. Can you manufacture the knife? And can you sharpen the knife on Shabbos? Now, you knew the 8th day was coming, right? The baby's born a week before. So you knew that you were going to need a knife on the 8th day, right? So since it's possible to manufacture and sharpen the knife before Shabbos, you don't do that on Shabbos, right? You should be doing that before Shabbos. There's no reason to not only draw blood on Shabbos, but to also violate the prohibition on manufacturing and sharpening and finishing this utensil, the knife. So that doesn't override Shabbos, since it could have been done before Shabbos. That's the principle that Rabbi Akiva is stating. And furthermore, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who said that the reaping of barley for the omer is a mitzvah, right? Not only is bringing the barley offering, but the reaping itself is a mitzvah. It's a portion of this procedure, but is a mitzvah in itself. As we learned in a Mishna, tractate Shevi'it 1:4, that Rabbi Yishmael says, the verse, in plowing time and in harvest, you shall rest. Exodus 34:21. Now, you might have thought that this means that every 7th year, right, when the temple is standing, we're practicing the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical year cycle, that this refers to in the 7th year, where we don't plow, we don't sow, we don't reap, right? We just let the land rest, and we're not involved in the work of food and other produce production. Right? So in plowing time and in harvest, you shall rest. But Rabbi Yishmael says this is not referring to the prohibition against farming the land during the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, as one might have thought. Rather, it is referring to the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos. Now, that prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos, which includes farming, it's been stated in so many other places. Why would we think that over here in Exodus 34:21, it's referring to that, where it seems to be in the context of referring to the Shemitah year? Why does he say it's actually applying to Shabbos? And the reason that the verse mentions these two particular forms of labor, right, plowing and harvesting, is to teach that just as the plowing is prohibited on Shabbos, and which plowing is prohibited on Shabbos? Plowing that is an otherwise voluntary act, right? When do you plow your field? Well, 6 days of the week you can plow. There's no time when the Torah commands you to plow, right? There's no fixed time for plowing. There's no obligation to plow on a set schedule. You plow whenever you want, as long as it's not Shabbos or Yom Tov. Right? So plowing is otherwise a voluntary act. This plowing is never required by the Torah. So too, the harvesting that is prohibited on Shabbos is voluntary harvesting, as distinguished from harvesting that is commanded by the Torah. Which harvesting is commanded by the Torah? Reaping for the purpose of bringing the omer offering. Therefore, the harvesting of the omer is excluded from that prohibition because it is a mitzvah. Therefore, the mitzvah of reaping the barley for the omer would override Shabbos, right? Consequently, the barley for the omer is harvested on the 16th of Nisan, even if it occurs on Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan explains why Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, reached his opinion by the following reasoning. If it enters your mind to say that barley for the omer offering that is reaped not in accordance with the procedure dictated by its mitzvah is nevertheless fit, right? This would be if you harvested it during the day rather than during the night. Then why would it override Shabbos? Let one reap it on Erev Shabbos. Rather, from the fact that the reaping overrides Shabbos, learn from here that if it was reaped not in accordance with its mitzvah, it is unfit, right? So, okay, it overrides Shabbos to do it on the 16th of Nisan, but we've already derived that it needs to be done during the night of 16th of Nisan. So since we are showing by all these proofs that it's very particular how you do this mitzvah, then if you harvested it during the day of the 16th of Nisan, maybe that would be permitted in terms of overriding Shabbos, but it would render that barley unfit. So therefore, even if it became tamei, but it was harvested at night, bring that tamei offering and don't go back out into the field to harvest during the day a second time. Now, the Gemara comments, isn't Rebbi also a student of Rabbi Shimon, who was a student of Rabbi Akiva? Since Rebbi was a student of Rabbi Shimon, and by extension of Rabbi Akiva, he should accept Rabbi Akiva's principle that any prohibited labor that can be performed on Shabbos Eve does not override Shabbos. If so, as Rebbi holds that if the omer was not performed at night, it should be done by day, why does its harvest override Shabbos? Let it be harvested on Erev Shabbos, right? If you don't have to do it during the night, so there's some flexibility about how you perform the mitzvah, okay, well then why harvest it if the 16th falls on Shabbos? Harvest it earlier so you don't violate Shabbos. And the Gemara cites a proof for its claim that Rebbi was a student of Rabbi Shimon. But isn't it Tana B'Raisa that Rebbi said, when we would study Torah with Rabbi Shimon in Tekoa, we would carry to him oil and a towel from the courtyard to the roof, and from the roof into an enclosure similar to a courtyard, and from one enclosure to another enclosure until we reached the spring, in which we would bathe without passing through a public domain, because they don't want to carry a towel through a public domain on Shabbos. So the Gemara answers that Rebbi concedes that reaping barley for the omer offering overrides Shabbos, in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. But this is not because it is unfit if reaped at an improper time. Rather, Rebbi holds in accordance with the other opinion of Rabbi Shimon. As it is taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Shimon said, come and see how dear is a mitzvah performed in its proper time, as burning the fats and limbs is valid all night. And therefore it is possible to wait until the conclusion of Shabbos and burn them at night. Right now we're talking about the daily offering and the additional offering which is brought on Shabbos. Right? So there are offerings that were brought on Shabbos. The daily offering that's brought every day overrides Shabbos. And the special additional offerings of Shabbos, of course, they override Shabbos. Right? Now, on Shabbos, other offerings weren't being brought. The temple wasn't crowded with individuals bringing their individual offerings. Those were not brought on Shabbos. They don't override Shabbos. So the priests working in the Holy Temple on Shabbos, it was a little bit of an easier day. Now, the remainder of offerings that need to be disposed of, right? They are burnt, and you can burn something that's an offering that's brought during the day. The parts that need to be burned can be burned all that night. But ideally, you burn them as soon as the offering is brought. So that's comparing the day to the night which follows it. So offerings that were brought on Shabbos, okay, you have to bring the offering on Shabbos, but the parts that need to be burned, let that be burned that night, which would be Motzi Shabbos, after Havdalah, after Shabbos ends. It's still valid from the timing of bringing offerings generally to burn those things that night. So why not do it that night rather than further desecrate Shabbos? Answer, you're not desecrating Shabbos. Now that it's permitted to bring that offering on Shabbos, do the whole mitzvah. It's available to you to do it now, especially the temple's not so crowded. There's no reason to wait until that night. do it in its time, even though it seems like it's further overriding the prohibition of burning on Shabbos, like you overrode the prohibition to slaughter and carry, etc. on Shabbos. Right, come and see how deer is a mitzvah performed in its proper time, as burning the fats and limbs is valid all night, and therefore it is possible to wait until the conclusion of Shabbos and burn them at night. But nevertheless, one would not wait with them until nightfall. Rather, one burns them immediately, even on Shabbos. Likewise, when it comes to the reaping of the omer, although it is fit if reaped during the previous day, reaping at night still overrides Shabbos, because a mitzvah is dear when performed in its proper time. I'm glad I'm reading this, and it's reminding me, sometimes the morning gets away from me, and I end up doing the morning prayer late. Or putting on tefillin late. I try not to do that. It doesn't happen so often, but sometimes it does. And why? Because I didn't prioritize it enough. I have a dear friend, his name is Eli. He davens nates, right? So always his morning prayers are at sunrise. Every day of the week, he gets up and he's there at the earliest possible time that it's permitted to say Shema, at the earliest possible time that it's permitted to say the Amidah, the standing prayer. That's when he's doing it. And he makes sure to do it as soon as it can be done in its time. And in that way, he never misses the time. The morning doesn't get away from him. It's very holy, very beautiful. I have not held myself to that standard, but at least I can be more mindful and determined and focused to not let those days that stuff comes up and gets in the way, and really what I've said is whatever, this person who's leaning on me at work or about work, I've said that person's more important to me than the Holy One above. It's a terrible calculus. I was wrong when I did that. Every time I'd let that happen. We're human. Of course, it happens to everybody. But I'd like to do better. I'm resolving to do better. That's something I'm going to be thinking about at the Seder tonight. That's a paro. I can't let that paro rule over me. Pharaoh. Okay. Page 72b. The Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, not know this? He must have known of his father's statement that a mitzvah performed at its proper time overrides Shabbos. If so, his ruling that reaping at an improper time is unfit cannot be proven from the fact that reaping the omer overrides Shabbos, as claimed earlier, right? These are two different reasons for overriding Shabbos. So rather, it must be that Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, was aware of that principle, and nevertheless he maintains that the requirement to perform a mitzvah at its optimal time does not apply to the case of the reaping of the omer. Why? This is because there, in the case of the burning of the fats and limbs, it is different, as the slaughter of the animal already overrode Shabbos. Therefore, it is dear to perform the burning of its fats and limbs at the proper time, even on Shabbos. One cannot apply this reasoning to the reaping of the omer, as there is no prior labor performed on Shabbos before the reaping. The reaping is the first thing that you do that overrides Shabbos. Consequently, the reason it may be performed on Shabbos must be that it would be unfit if reaped at any other time. And the Gemara asks, but if so, according to Rebbi, he should agree that the case of the burning of the sacrifices, fats and limbs is different from the omer, since also there the slaughter of the animal already overrode Shabbos. Therefore, the Gemara gives a new explanation. Rather, Rebbi holds that in fact the reaping of the omer crop does not override Shabbos, in contrast to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And for this reason, Rebbi's ruling that the omer is fit, if reaped at an improper time, does not conflict with the principle of his teacher Rabbi Akiva, that any prohibited labor that can be performed on Shabbos Eve, right before Shabbos, would not override Shabbos. And so the Gemara says, wait, what? So is Rebbi saying we don't reap if the omer, bring the omer falls on Shabbos? The Gemara asks, and does Rebbi not maintain that the reaping of the omer overrides Shabbos? But didn't we learn in a Mishna on page 63b in response to Rabbi Yishmael's opinion that when the 16th of Nisan occurred during the week, 5 sah of barley were reaped, and when it occurred on Shabbos, only 3 sah were reaped. In the end, the halacha is that we reap 3 on any day of the week, Shabbos or weekday, and it's from those 3 sah that are reaped, right, that the 10th of an ephah is finally winnowed and sifted and turned into the meal offering of the omer. But the point is that there was a measure for when we reap on Shabbos. Okay? And the rabbis say, both on Shabbos and during the week, the omer offering would come from 3 sah. But in any case, according to both opinions, the omer was reaped on Shabbos. That includes Rebbi's opinion. So the Gemara answers that Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbi. Oh, Rebbi didn't agree with this. The Gemara raises difficulty from the latter clause of that Mishnah. Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, says, on Shabbos, the barley was reaped by an individual with 1 sickle and 1 basket into which the barley was placed, whereas during the week, it was reaped by 3 people with 3 baskets and 3 sickles. And the majority, who disagree with Rabbi Hanina, the rabbis say, both on Shabbos and during the week, it is reaped by 3 people with 3 baskets and 3 sickles. According to both opinions, the omer was reaped on Shabbos. But the Gemara again responds, yeah, well, that clause of the Mishnah is also not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbi. Seems like Rebbi would not have allowed reaping on Shabbos, but he was in the minority, and even though he redacted the Mishnah, he left himself out of it. The Gemara raises another difficulty, right? Rebbi was the editor of the Mishnah. If he doesn't say he objects, and he includes that all opinions show that, maybe different measure, but we harvest on Shabbos. I mean, we harvest the barley for the omer even on Shabbos. He must agree with it, right? But now the Gemara is saying, well, no, maybe he didn't agree with it. So he just, he didn't agree with it and he didn't log his minority opinion. Very humble. Let's keep reading. The Gemara raised another difficulty from the Mishna on page 65a that describes the series of questions posed by the court emissary who reaps the grain to those assembled to witness the process, right? It's a beautiful ceremony in the middle of the night when they're actually reaping the barley, right? Shall we reap, right? And if the 16th of Nisan occurs on Shabbos, the court emissary says to those who are assembled, shall I cut the sheaves on this Shabbos? And the assembly says in response, yes. And the Gemara answers, that clause of the Mishnah is also not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbi. So he's writing all these rules into the Mishnah that he doesn't agree with. And the Gemara raises a difficulty in the Mishnah on page 71a. Yesterday's page, if the omer was reaped during the day, it is fit, and it overrides Shabbos. Now, whom did you hear who said, if the omer was reaped during the day, it is fit? Rebbi. And yet it is taught in the Mishnah and it overrides Shabbos. What? Is it not referring to reaping? And the Gemara answers, no, it is referring to the sacrifice of the omer offering. The Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. But with regard to reaping, does it not override Shabbos according to Rebbi? As isn't it taught in a baraisa that Rebbi said the following law based upon the verse, quote, and Moses declared the appointed times of the Lord to the children of Israel in Leviticus 23:44. Right? This was the basic recital in the Torah of the holidays. And it starts with Shabbos, and then it mentions the other holidays. Now, what is the meaning when the verse states this phrase? Well, this phrase is necessary because we had learned only that the daily offering and the Pesach override Shabbos and Tuma, as it is stated concerning them in its appointed time. And we learned that at Numbers 9:2 and at Numbers 28:2, from which it is derived that each of them must be sacrificed in its appointed time, even if they fall on Shabbos, and in its appointed time, even if the offering has become tamei, ritually impure. So the Brisa continues with regard to the rest of the communal offerings. From where is it derived that they likewise override Shabbos and Tuma? The verse states with regard to additional offerings that are brought on the festivals, these you shall sacrifice to the Lord in your appointed times. In your appointed times means even if it falls on Shabbos and even if the offering became tamei. And there was no alternative, right? So the Brisa continues, from where is it derived to include in this law the omer and the lambs that are sacrificed with it, the 2 loaves sacrificed on Shavuos, and the communal peace offerings that are sacrificed with them, the 2 lambs of Shavuos? And the verse states, quote, and Moses declared the appointed times of the Lord to the children of Israel. And after that, it lists Shabbos and Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, right? So the offerings of Shabbos, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot override Shabbos. Bringing those offerings overrides the otherwise prohibitions of Shabbos. So the Gemara analyzes, after it listed Shabbos and the festivals, and this indicates that the verse established one time for all of them. All of these days are considered appointed times, and their offerings are not deferred even if they need to be brought on Shabbos. Now the Gemara analyzes the Baraisa with regard to what ritual does the Baraisa state that these offerings override Shabbos. If we say for the actual sacrifice, this cannot be correct, as the 2 loaves, are the 2 loaves fit for sacrifice? Loaves are not sacrificed. The 2 loaves are not sacrificed on the altar at all. Rather, they are waved and then eaten by the priests. So the Gemara concludes its interpretation of the Brisa, which leads to the question about the opinion of Rebbi. So rather, it is obvious that the 2 loaves override Shabbos with regard to grinding and sifting, 2 otherwise prohibited labors on Shabbos, but needed to make loaves on that day. And if so, similarly with regard to the omer offering, it overrides Shabbos with regard to what is needed to bring those loaves of the omer. And what's needed? Reaping, because you can't reap until the 16th of Nisan. Reaping, and so that includes reaping the grains, as well as grinding, sifting, etc. And as the Baraisa is the opinion of Rebbi, evidently, he maintains that the reaping of the omer does override Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, rather, one must say that the Baraisa is not referring to comparable cases. As far as the omer is concerned, it overrides Shabbos only with regard to its actual sacrifice. But when it comes to the 2 loaves, it overrides Shabbos with regard to its baking. And the reason why the 2 loaves must be baked on Shabbos is because Rebbi holds that the oven consecrates that which is baked inside it, right? That the oven is not only part of the process of bringing these loaves, but it is actually the moment at which that dough becomes the offering, right? It becomes consecrated by this vessel. Just like when an animal is shechted as a sacrifice, when does it actually become consecrated as a sacrifice? Right? When the blood is received in a vessel and then, walked over to the altar and poured on the altar. But that vessel consecrates the blood. We don't have that for these loaves. There's no vessel to hold the loaves, but there's the oven acting as that vessel. And the reason why the 2 loaves must be baked on Shabbos is because Rebbi holds that the oven consecrates that which is baked inside it. Therefore, if one were to bake from the previous day on Erev Shavuos, he would effectively be disqualifying it from being brought on Shavuos day, as it would be disqualified by being left overnight. It's reached the stage where it's consecrated to go. It's go time for that offering. But if you did that before, the day before, in order not to override Shabbos, you'd be in a situation where by doing the baking before Shabbos, by the time you're ready to bring the offering, it's disqualified because you had already made it into an offering when you baked it. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara asks, let me do a quick reload. Okay. So the Gemara asks, and does Rebbi really hold that the oven consecrates that which is baked inside it? But isn't it taught in the Baraisa, the communal peace offering of 2 lambs that accompanies the 2 loaves of Shavuos, consecrate the loaves that accompany them only by means of their slaughter, right? The loaves of Shavuos, very unique case, not like other meal offerings, because they come as a unit with the 2 lambs. The 2 loaves and the 2 lambs, they have to go together. And they're not ancillary to the 2 lambs. In fact, we explored, are the lambs ancillary to the loaves or are the loaves ancillary to the lambs? Answer, they come as a unit, right? So here, in terms of what consecrates them as a unit, perhaps it's the slaughter of the lambs. How so? If one slaughtered the lambs for their own sake, right? You knew that these were the lambs of Shavuos, and the priest sprinkled their blood on the altar for their own sake, then the loaves are consecrated. To teach you that if you made a mistake, if you thought these lambs were just some other offering, some individual offering, some other different offering than the lambs of Shavuos, and you slaughtered them with the wrong lambs in mind, or you slaughtered them as the lambs of Shavuos, but when you sprinkled the blood on the altar, you thought you were sprinkling the blood of some other offering on the altar, then the loaves would not be consecrated because you messed up this whole thing. We got a big problem now, right? All the steps have to be done right. The lamb slaughtered for its sake, its blood sprinkled for its sake, in order for the loaves to become consecrated as the loaves of Shavuos, which will be waved and then eaten by the priests. So that Baraisa continues. But if one slaughtered them not for their own sake, and the priests sprinkled their blood not for their own sake, then the loaves are not consecrated, as the factors indispensable in rendering the offering fit were not properly performed. Now, you couldn't wave those loaves and eat them, have the priest eat them, and say you fulfilled your obligation on Shavuos. You would not have fulfilled your obligation. If one slaughtered the lambs for their own sake, and he sprinkled their blood not for their own sake, the fact that the lambs were properly slaughtered renders the loaves partially consecrated. Therefore, the loaves are consecrated to the extent that they cannot be redeemed. They've gone too far for that. But they're not consecrated to the extent that they may be eaten by the priests. This is the statement of Rebbi. Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, says actually the loaves are consecrated only when one slaughters the offerings for their own sake and sprinkles their blood for their own sake, i.e. only if both factors, indispensable in rendering the offering fit, were properly performed. So apparently, from this teaching, Rebbi holds that it is the slaughter of the lambs that consecrates the loaves, not baking the loaves in the oven. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, actually, Rebbi does hold that the oven consecrates the loaves, and what the Baraisa is saying when it uses the categories of consecrated and not consecrated with regard to the slaughter of the lambs is that either of the 2 loaves are fixed as Shavuos meal offerings and cannot be used for any other offering, or they are not fixed as Shavuos meal offerings. In other words, if the lambs were slaughtered and the blood sprinkled in the proper manner, one cannot change the designation of the loaves. Whereas, if they were not slaughtered and their blood was not sprinkled properly, one could change the designation of those loaves to some other kind of meal offering. Really? I guess they could be changed to the leavened loaves of a Thanksgiving offering. It's the only other place where we have leavened loaves. If the lambs were slaughtered properly, but their blood was sprinkled improperly, the status of the loaves is subject to a dispute. This has nothing to do with when the loaves are consecrated. So where did we end up? Bottom line, we're not sure if Rebbi agrees with it or not, but he did put it into the Mishnas that reaping the barley for the omer offering in its time certainly overrides Shabbos, and some would say even if you had to do it during the day, it overrides Shabbos. Doesn't that render them unfit? If they became tamei and you couldn't get tahor, ritually pure loaves, then you slaughtered. The meal offering of the omer offering, then you would bring it when it is tamei. And that concludes our discussion not only of Mishnah number 9, but also of chapter 6. And with God's help, Saturday night after Shabbos ends, that's our next class, we'll continue with chapter 7. Now I'll just take a couple comments, but reminder, no class tomorrow, Thursday for Passover, no class Friday for Passover. Then it's Shabbos, and we'll have a class, God willing, Saturday night when Shabbos ends in L.A. Ilanit says, Kasher Sameach from Silver Spring, Maryland. Get ready to bust out of Egypt. See you on the other side. Amen. Beautiful. Hag Pesach is a mitzvah. Yes, absolutely. Keep Passover, all the different mitzvahs of Passover are a mitzvah. They are a commandment. We don't slaughter the lamb, which could also be a goat, in its first year, since the temple was destroyed. And so, in the Haggadah, what we read about is these sages who debated all night about how the story of the Exodus from Egypt should be told, when it should be told, in what manner it should be told, and that became the basis of what we do now on Passover, reciting the Haggadah, retelling the story. Because the Torah says 4 times, you shall tell to your child what happened to us when we left Egypt. So what's fascinating about that is that those sages in the Haggadah, they witnessed the destruction of the Second Temple. They were the ones charged with figuring out what Judaism would look like in a world without a holy temple. And where did they meet? In Bnei Barak. Who was the chief rabbi of Bnei Barak? Rabbi Akiva. Right? There was something about Rabbi Akiva's, not only his incredible acumen as a sage, but also his positivity, right? Rabbi Akiva is the one who laughed when the other sages cried, seeing a fox running over the ruins of the temple, right? They could only see the ruins of the temple. But Rabbi Akiva said, we've seen a prophecy, it's in the Bible, right? That there will be a fox running over the ruins of the temple. And now that we've seen that, we also know that God will keep his promises. He'll never let the Jewish people go. Eventually, we will all be brought back from among the nations. The third temple will be rebuilt, and we will enter the age of Mashiach, the Messianic age. And I'm not seeing any other questions. But Sharon says, flashback to our studies way back when I made my her Erev Tavshilin, in order to be able to cook for Shabbos, right? So we did that last night with Nina here. We put aside a hard-boiled egg and some matzah and declared that we had started cooking for Shabbos before the holiday of Passover begins, right? Passover or any Yom Tov, any festival, is like Shabbos in that you can't do work. You can't do all the 39 prohibited labors that were needed for creating the tabernacle in the wilderness. With one exception, you can cook. You can cook on a festival. You can't cook on Shabbos. You cook before Shabbos. But if Shabbos, like this year, is Saturday, and it's Yom Tov, the holiday, Thursday and Friday, well, when are we going to cook for Shabbos? We can't cook for Shabbos on Wednesday and have a beautiful meal that's going to be there for Saturday if we cook it now. So we're going to end up cooking. It's permitted to cook on Yom Tov, but only for the needs of Yom Tov. So what's going to permit us to cook for Shabbos on Friday when it's still Passover? We create this legal device, the Erev Tavshilin, which says we're mingling the cooking of festival for Shabbos, because we've already begun cooking for Shabbos by setting aside that little piece of that meal. And we learned about that, right, in Tractate Eruvin. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you Saturday night after Shabbos. In the meantime, Hag Kasher V'Sameach. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.